I have some uncomfortable information to share with you right now, and it has to do with the direction that the United States is headed, as well as the entire world. So, if you're someone who doesn't like conflict, you don't like thinking about difficult situations, don't watch this. But if you're an investor who cares about preserving your wealth and also identifying specific opportunities that are very lucrative, you are going to want to understand what's happening right now as I speak, because events are unfolding that by themselves don't look very important. But when you combine all these events together, you see a bigger picture that is developing, and it's very clear where the US and the world is headed. Now, this bigger picture, many people think is World War III. Now, this World War III that I'm going to be talking about is much more of a cultural, political, and economic war that is being fought amongst many different nations around the world. I actually believe 50 years from now, we'll look back on this time and say, this is when World War III started. This is when the conflict started. It was in the early 2020s. It's very noticeable if you take a zoomed out view and see the sanctions that the West is putting on certain countries, see the tension between China and the US and Taiwan, see the war that's going on in Russia and Ukraine, see what's going on around Israel, and see the global conflicts that are unfolding in real time. But when we're in it right now, it's very difficult to see. And for investors, there are some huge risks that you should be avoiding, but there are also huge opportunities that you should be considering getting into right now. So I'm going to show you a bunch of events that are unfolding as I speak. And once you see them all together, you're going to see something that is very clear. So let's dive in. Let's look back in history because there are some similarities to what was happening before World War II to today. And once you see these similarities, you're going to understand this bigger picture much better. As you'll see right now, there is a poster here from an America First rally. This was from 1941, right before the US entered World War II. The words on this poster is very similar to the messaging that we see in the Trump campaign right now. America First rally, let's stay out of Europe's war, make America safe for democracy. This is what a large portion of Americans think and want. They don't want nothing to do with other skirmishes, other disagreements that are going on around the world. And this is exactly the same as prior to World War II. However, during this time, the American government actually was preparing for a war. And behind the scenes, even though a lot of these political posters don't say it, the US was economically preparing for a war. There are many different specific programs that were going on. One example is the cash and carry policy, which was designed to keep Americans out of the conflict. This was a market open for buyers where American factories increased their production. What happened was unemployment continued to fall and inflation became a concern. Exactly what's happening today. The US is giving money to Ukraine, but what's actually happening, a lot of that money is staying within the US to fund weapons manufacturers and other types of manufacturing. So we have unemployment falling, and we have inflation becoming a recurring issue. Now, the sentiment in 1939, which was before World War II, here you can see right here, this is a Gallup poll from 1939. The US was okay with selling food supplies or selling airplanes and other war materials to England and France. By the way, totally different than today. We are just giving a lot of this, a lot of the money and materials to Ukraine. But the US was open to selling those things back then. We were not open to sending our Army and Navy abroad to fight against Germany. And again, this was in 1939. However, as time went on, things changed. This program right here, which is called the Lend-Lease program, which opened the floodgates for U.S. war aid. This was actually originally proposed by Churchill, and Churchill proposed that the U.K. would provide different land use rights around the world for the U.S. in exchange for the U.S. providing war effort materials, food, manufacturing, etc. to the U.K. And this is very similar to what's going on in Ukraine right now, where we are providing weapons and all sorts of support, even though we're not fully involved in the fight. We are definitely supporting Ukraine. We are definitely supporting Israel. We are definitely supporting many different players globally to fight against countries that we are really against right now. If we go to the history of World War II and how public sentiment changed, this is a pretty amazing graphic here. You can see prior to 1941, when we got bombed in Pearl Harbor, the U.S. did not want to help abroad. They did not want to enter the war and actually became more emphatically against it. You can see 71% here did not want to get involved, and then 93%, but then it starts to change. And then the US population realized, oh my gosh, we should help out. Oh my gosh, we should help out. 52%. Oh my gosh, 60%, we should help out. Until 67%. And then this is prior to the bombing in Pearl Harbor, June 22nd, 1941. 62% of Americans said, let's help out. Then, of course, this is right before Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was December 7th. This is September 19th through 24th. 64% still said, let's go in. You can see it just kept going up until after Pearl Harbor, over 90% of the US population wanted to go and join World War II. So how does that compare to today? Let me show you. Republicans and Democrats are increasing their support for Ukraine, and it's the highest ever since this poll has been taken in 2023, for as long as it takes. Democrats and Republicans are increasing their support for Ukraine for as long as it takes. This is very similar to what I just showed you during World War II, where sentiment started to change. Okay, let's go to what's going on right now for American views on military aid to Ukraine. Over 50% of the US population wants to increase or maintain the amount of aid we are providing to Ukraine. What will happen in the future? This percentage will probably increase. Crazy enough. This is an important announcement that I want to show you, and it's going to lead into the events that are unfolding right now that have to do with the preparations the U.S. is making to possibly have a larger conflict. This was an announcement 2 years ago in 2022, securing a made in America supply chain for critical minerals. A lot of this announcement talks about electrical vehicles and the battery supply chain that the U.S. needs. Really, what you're reading through here is a guise for what the U.S. actually needs, which is security to have access to critical minerals, rare earth metals, and general resources that the U.S. has no access to because China has taken over a lot of the production and refinery of. That's not to say the U.S. isn't resource rich. The U.S. just currently isn't producing a lot of it. So this is 2 years ago that the U.S. said, hey, we need to actually secure our supply chains. Fast forward to 2 years later, which was a couple weeks ago, the Biden-Harris administration takes further action to strengthen and secure critical mineral supply chains. In this announcement, they start to talk about clean energies, high-capacity batteries, wind turbines, semiconductors, and they don't talk as much about electrical vehicles, but it's very, very evident what they're talking about here is securing the U.S. so there are much more safe supply chains, which leads to what I'm going to talk about next. The Department of Defense has been releasing a ton of press releases over the past couple of weeks, and they all relate to supply chains, critical minerals, rare earth metals, and specific processes that the Department of Defense needs to create weapons and military equipment. You can see here, Office of Strategic Capital announces first notice of funding availability to secure the U.S. industrial base. Okay, let's move to what they're actually looking to fund. Here's a list of everything. This is super high-tech stuff: advanced bulk materials, biochemicals, biomass, data fabric, edge computing, mesh networks, sensor hardware, spacecraft, space launch, quantum computing. This is very high-end manufacturing and very sophisticated technology. Here's an announcement that just came out. This is not even a week ago. Department of Defense awards $43 million to U.S. universities to purchase equipment for defense-related research. This number, $43 million, not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things, but this is an example of one little thing that by itself doesn't look like much, but what I'm going to show you in just a second, you're going to start to realize what's going on here. I have a list of what the DoD is actually funding. These are many different universities. I'm not going to show you the actual names of the people, but you can see what is going on here. Microwave source for coherent perfect absorption, low power real-time passive acoustic triggering system for autonomous ocean observing technologies. It could continue on and on, but you can see this is very, very high-end, very, very technical work that is being developed in universities, and the U.S. government is currently supplying funding to purchase supplies for these universities to dive into these different projects. Moving along, let's get into some press releases that the Department of Defense has been releasing over the past year, but really over the past couple of months have really started to heat up. Department of Defense awards $30 million to expand domestic printed circuit board and substrate production. Here's another one, $15 million for increased heavy forge production. Another one, $12 million for lithium. Another one, $19 million for tin processing. Again, this is September. All of these releases are just in the past couple of weeks. $26 million for more defense applications. $269 million for microelectronics manufacturing. Department of Defense awards $4 million for terbium and other rare earth elements. And again, this is a very small press release. $4 million is not that much money. But when you combine it with all these other press releases, you see what's going on here. You see that the Department of Defense is preparing for a scenario where they are cut off from their strategic or from their traditional suppliers, which for a long time now has been China. China has a stranglehold on a lot of the rare earth metals markets. Here's another one for $25 million for strategic radiation hardened microelectronics supply chain. Here's another one, $20 million for cobalt and large capacity battery supply chain. This is in August of this year. Another one, $11 million for domestic lithium carbonate processing and production. Another one, $23 million for domestic aluminum casting supply chain. $20 million for manganese. $14 million for cobalt and graphite supply chain. This was earlier in this year, May. I have cherry picked a lot of these press releases. You can go in for yourself. Go look in the press releases from the Department of Defense. You'll see many of these press releases relating to supply chain and these critical metals and minerals. Politico just released an article that's very interesting and relates to all of this. The Biden administration weighs price support for U.S. critical minerals amid Chinese pressure. You may be thinking that this is some Biden administration game. This is a much bigger issue, so don't get involved or don't think about too much about politics. What's going on right now is the Chinese are flooding the U.S. and global market with rare earth minerals and metals. And what they're doing is they're driving down price of these resources. That is preventing other markets from producing these minerals and resources at in a scenario where they can make money. So China is further driving down these prices and further controlling the market. The U.S. government is basically saying that they would like to have a price support to enable U.S. Producers to compete with the Chinese market, because the fear is that China could do a rug pull, that China could make other markets like the U.S. completely dependent on China and then all of a sudden pull away that supply. And as you can see here, let me show you, they're calling this a perfect storm. And the House Select Committee is saying it's dangerously dependent on Chinese minerals and recommended creating a national mineral strategic reserve. We do not have that right now. We do have a strategic reserve of some metals and minerals, but we don't have a lot of the critical rare earth metals that we need. So this is happening right now as we're speaking. If we shift over to the U.S. State Department, you can see they're also making measures. The United States of America and Argentina signed an MOU to strengthen cooperation on critical minerals. Move over to Peru, same exact thing. Move over to Ecuador, same exact thing. And here is the largest statement, the Joint Statement of Establishment of the Minerals Security Partnership Finance Network. This is between the US, Australia, Canada, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, India, Italy, Japan, South Korea, Norway, Sweden, the UK, and the EU. Notably missing China, Russia, and other players that are huge resource contributors to the global economy. This specific statement establishes a finance network so these nations can freely supply and exchange these metals and minerals, and it cuts out a lot of the other part of the world. So as an investor, what should you be thinking here? You should be thinking, first of all, this is a clear sign that the U.S. is preparing for more and more conflict. This is a clear sign that the U.S. is preparing just like it did prior to World War II. Let's assume that we do not have a World War III. Let's assume that we do not have any further conflict, because I could dive into that for a long time. For investors right now, the government is literally funding private companies that are publicly traded, so not public or not state-held companies. These are companies that are mining in the U.S., processing metals, their refineries, their manufacturing facilities. The U.S. is currently providing money to these companies through these different grants and awards. And you can invest in these companies right now. So if you're an investor seeing this trend happening, seeing that the DoD and the State Department is working very hard to provide money and new relationships to establish multiple different supply chains for metals and minerals and resources, you can start investing in this opportunity right now. Conversely, there's many areas of the world that you should be very careful with, because as supply chains break down, as relationships break down, there are going to be companies and investments that get caught in the middle. So you want to be very careful about what investments you have and consider shifting towards opportunities that are much more secure from a US and Western perspective. Now, I'll dive into a lot of this in the future, but I hope this gives a bigger picture of what's going on with the US, how they're treating their supply chains, and how they are looking at the critical elements, the critical minerals, the critical metals and resources that they need to produce possibly more weapons and military resources for potentially a larger global conflict. All right, guys, see you later.